history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme, as the saying goes, right? It does kind of, you can see similar patterns, right? So we're going to fast forward, like I said, back to 1775, right? So in 1775, so you got the American colonies, you got 13 colonies there, and you obviously got Britain and stuff, and Britain, from a few years from before, had just fought the 7 Years' War against the French. So they kicked the French out of Canada. So the American colonists, they were now secured from the threat of the French invading them. So it wasn't unreasonable from the eyes of the British Parliament to be like, right, okay, these colonists benefited a lot from our efforts in this war and stuff, right? People in England obviously paying taxes to pay for this, right? Well, okay, we're not going to charge the colonists the same amount as we would in England, but we're going to charge them a little bit, just to kind of, just to raise a bit of revenue and stuff, and that way, we can, help them and they can help us, right? So that was the idea. However, the way that Americans responded to this was, well, with the Boston Tea Party, right, in 1773. So that was a huge revolt and stuff to do with having taxes, because the thing is, it wasn't about the taxes, it was about, as they said, no taxation without representation. So what you have to understand about the American colonies is that obviously most of the people from these colonies had come from Britain, right? And societies tend to be a kind of a time capsule in many ways about the society that they came from, right? So England in those days, was very, very focused on liberty. People there were obsessed with liberty. If only people were still like that now. But anyway, so anyway, they were really, really obsessed with this idea of liberty and stuff, of life, liberty, and property, right? And so for the American colonists, they had the idea of no taxation representation. So whereas in Britain, obviously you didn't have universal suffrage in those days, but you did have parliamentary representation, right? So your local MP represented your interests and stuff, or at least was in theory supposed to and stuff, right? So in the same way that children, for instance, in our present day, they can't vote, but they're still represented by their local MP. So that means that people in Britain at least have some semblance of representation, right? And the problem is that for the Americans, their colonies had no representation in the British Parliament. And so they were annoyed not about the taxes themselves, but they were annoyed at the fact that the British Parliament was imposing taxes on them, which they in America had zero say on it. There wasn't one US colonist who could have any say on what the taxes ought to be imposed on them, right? So that's what was the kind of the spark for this, right? But as with all independence cases, there's not anytime a country wants to get independent, it's a messy thing, right? So people at the beginning, yes, obviously you've got some radicals who are like, we should just secede, right? But most people for a very long time are very much like, okay, we just want a bit more autonomy, we want a bit more respect, etc., etc. So this is kind of what the American colonists were doing, right? And so, for instance, the most misquoted quote in American history, has got to be, the British are coming, the British are coming. Because they never would have said the British are coming, right? What they actually said was the regulars are coming, right? So the British regulars, the soldiers are coming. Because this was when the rebels obviously are starting to, rise up and stuff, right? And the British regular troops are coming to crush it, right? So in 1775, this is when you had the battles at Lexington and Concord, and this is when so-called shots fired around the world occur, right? So this is the British troops firing on American colonists, right? And this really starts to heat things up. This is what's seen as the beginning of the American Revolution or the American War of Independence, right? So what ends up happening is that the next year you end up having Thomas Paine, as we discussed in previous videos. He writes the pamphlet Common Sense, and this is to this day the most popular pamphlet sold in America. Sold absolutely millions and stuff. And what this was arguing for was basically this idea, or first of all, it was arguing against the necessity of a monarchy and stuff, but it was arguing for independence. And the main thing that he was arguing, and bear in mind, Thomas Paine was an Englishman, he was born an Englishman, right? But he was saying, how can a continent be governed by an island thousands of miles away? This doesn't make any sense yet, right? And a continent ought to govern itself in the same way an island ought to govern itself, right? And so that was the argument that was made, right? And so, fast forward a few months now, because that was, that pamphlet came out in, I believe, January of 1776. So by July, that's when you having the Declaration of Independence, by Thomas Jefferson, etc., etc. So this begins the road to a long bloody war, yeah, right, which it effectively was ended by 1781, but like really it didn't fully officially end until 1783. So you had 8 years of warfare, right, that the new American Republic was born into, right? And in many ways this wasn't just a, as with all kind of independence wars and stuff, right, it's not a simple thing of, you're fighting against the kind of the foreign kind of like colonizer, right? You're also fighting basically a civil war. Because within America, you had many people who were loyalists, right? Who were loyalists to the crown, who thought, this is a bad idea, right? And what you tend to find is that these loyalists tended to congregate in the major cities such as New York and stuff, right? Whereas the people who were like, basically the rebels, the ones who wanted independence, tended to congregate more within the countryside and within like small towns around America, right? So these are the ones who wanted independence, and the loyalists are the ones who were opposed to independence, right? Now, after this, basically the Civil War, this war for independence and stuff, many loyalists did like migrate to Canada. Many of them migrated to England and stuff, but many of them stayed where they were. And even some of the ones who went to Canada, some of them eventually came back and stuff, right? So for a long time afterwards, there was a lot of grumbling between like people who were living within the new United States, right? And also, just something to kind of bear in mind is that when America, obviously, first of all, it fought this war against Britain, but, America at this time was heavily dependent on trade, both with Britain and with its empire, right? So in 1770, 57% of America's trade was done with Great Britain and what today is Northern Ireland, right? So this is not even including Ireland, this is not including Canada, this is not including the Caribbean, most of which was obviously owned by the British and stuff, right? So when you total up all of that, you're talking about roughly 90%, if not excess of 90% of Americans' exports going to the British Empire. And so if you're making the argument back in those days for, like, should the colonies get their independence, you'd be like, hold on, this is the mother country, we speak the same tongue. Literally, some of us were literally born there. Some of our either our parents or grandparents or people within living like memory and stuff, came to this country from that country, right? So we're not going to what are you talking about? Yeah, it doesn't make any economic sense here. And then on top of that, when they got their independence, right, like, as a result of Hamilton's policies, so Alexander Hamilton, of course, he's the one who sets up, like, most US tax revenue in those days, for the federal government came from tariffs, right? So tariffs obviously are taxes on imports. So if most of the trade is done with Britain and its empire, who are those tariffs mainly going to be affecting? Britain and its empire, right? So your largest trading partner, you're basically putting tariffs on them, right? And this led to a lot of tensions between Britain and America. On top of that, also you end up having eventually the War of 1812, which went on from 1812 to 1814. And in 1814, the British were so annoyed with America that they invaded Washington DC and burnt the White House down, right? So this kind of gives you a bit of an idea. This is almost like, so you're talking about almost 40 years after the Declaration of Independence, right? A lot of people, if you looked at them and basically was like, was it a good thing? A lot of people in these colonies would be like, yeah, see, I told you we should have stayed with Britain. Like kind of, it doesn't make any sense, right? And actually, if we look on in economic terms, right, we can see that America at that time, so Britain at that time had a GDP per capita of around $2,900. This is measured in 1990s dollars terms, whereas America had just $2,400, right? So Britain at the time was like better off than the American colonies, right? And actually, for a long time afterwards, you can see basically a kind of stagnant economic growth and stuff here, where the standard of living in America doesn't really increase over a period of 40 to 50 years after independence, right? So even 40 to 50 years afterwards, it's still not apparent whether independence actually made economic sense for the Americans. However, obviously, as we already know from like just world history and stuff, right, by 1880, America's standard of living surpasses that of Britain. And also around this time, this is when America, which had no colonies at this point, end up having a GDP which is larger than Britain, which had the largest empire the world has ever seen, right? So, talking almost 100 years after independence, this is when it suddenly makes sense. Like, oh, look, you see that they had a point, yeah, like kind of, So like this is where it clearly has shown that in the long run, it's made sense for us to have been independent from the British Empire, right? So it took a long, long time, and now obviously, if we fast forward to the present day, no one's arguing that America should be like tied to Britain still, right? And people in hindsight can now look back at it and go, oh yeah, they did the smart thing. They were big brain when they got independence, right? Because America's standard of living today is far in excess of what Britain's is, right? So what the point I'm making with this is that when things happen in history, we have to look at things in a broad sense, yeah. And even a generation after something happens, yeah, right. Even 2 generations afterwards, it's not immediately apparent that the decision was a good one in the end. Right, so now we've looked at American independence. Now we can fast forward a little bit and look at Irish independence, right? So obviously we've covered Irish history extensively on this channel. Check out our videos on like what if Ireland united, like both that one and the Q&A, and also the clip videos taken of that. Well, the clip videos, the same thing, whatever. But the point with that is that we've covered a lot of that. Although in one of the comments, someone was like, "Oh, you forgot to include about like what Cromwell did to Ireland." Yes, Cromwell killed many people in Ireland, but again, that was in the 17th century. So yes, it was kind of relevant. It's obviously relevant. It's one of the things that happened, but like there's a lot of things which happened over many hundreds of years of British rule in Ireland. But with all that being said, we fast forward now to the 19th century. So obviously you had the potato famine in 1845, but that was also the same year in which the Catholics got emancipation, right? So this is when Catholics in Britain and in Ireland got the right to vote, right? So this is something to really bear in mind, yeah, that the United Kingdom was the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, right? You can even see this in the Union flag today, yeah, right? You can see the cross of St. Patrick is there, right? And that's because Ireland was an integral part, not just of the British Empire, but of Britain itself, right? Within like, the UK itself, yeah, like it was an integral part. So I know a lot of Irish people get triggered if you say, no, we're not British, whatever. But the point is, yeah, right, if you look at it, Ireland played a huge part in Britain, in like its domestic policy, and also in its colonial policy, right? So a lot of Irish people kind of will try and pretend this didn't really happen and stuff, yeah. But Irish people, they played a big part like across the whole of the empire and stuff, right? They fought in the different wars, they colonized many of the different places, yeah. So they played a massive part in it. And yet Ireland in 1922 got its independence. Why did it get its independence? Well, again, as happened with the American colonies, right? It wasn't like an overnight thing. They didn't overnight just want independence, right? There was a big push for what was known as home rule. So home rule, that's what we would today call devolution, right? So the Irish basically wanted to have their own parliament in Dublin, where they would vote on like local issues and stuff, yeah, like, and like a handful of things, yeah, right? Now, obviously, this was opposed by the Unionists up in the north and stuff. That's a separate conversation which we covered before. Yeah, but the point is that up until what happened on the Easter Rising in 1916, there wasn't really a massive push for Ireland to be independent, right? And actually, when the Easter Rising happened, yes, this is obviously when like the kind of revolutionaries kind of like took over in Dublin and stuff, right? And like they took the post office there. So people in Ireland, the way they reacted to that was like, oh, what are these people doing? It's like, we're fighting a war, and we've got people like Irish people like fighting on like the Western Front and stuff, yeah, against the Germans and stuff, and fighting for king and country, yeah. What are they doing and stuff, yeah? Like, this is madness, right? However, how the British dealt with that, much in the same way as how they dealt with Lexington and Concord, because they came down in such a hard line way against the rebels here, yeah, right, because they lined them up against the wall and just executed them, right? This is what actually caused a lot of Irish people to like switch like their opinions, right? And this is when they started to become in favour of independence. So you can see this in the final election where United Kingdom and Ireland as a whole, where they had like an actual election and stuff, and this was in 1918, right? And you can see that overwhelmingly in what like later became the Republic of Ireland, and also like some places in the north, right, they were voting for Sinn Féin, right? So you can already see that like they are now clearly wanting independence, right? However, Irish independence, just like with American independence, is not as straightforward, right? So obviously, again, as happened in America, you had like major cities. So in America, it was obviously places like New York. However, in Ireland, Dublin, these places were strongholds of loyalism, right? So that's something we often forget, that many people in Dublin were like, we don't want to leave, right? Like, kind of, we're happy to be part of the British Empire and stuff, right? And many people across the island were like, no, we don't want to leave the British Empire. Like, we're an integral part. Like, we actually, unlike in like the American colonies, where they had no representation, in the case of Ireland, they had representation. 105 out of 707 MPs sat in the British Parliament were Irish, right? So now you kind of understand, like, kind of, oh, right, they have quite a strong argument for not wanting to leave, like the greatest empire that has ever existed, right? So what ended up happening is that you end up having a really bloody war for independence, and then in conclusion to it, they end up being, the so-called like kind of Anglo-Irish treaty, and this basically split Northern Ireland from what would become the Irish Free State, right? So within like the Free State, there was a division between the people who were pro-treaty and people who were anti-treaty, right? If you watch the film Michael Collins, it's really, really good. Highly recommend it. It's got Liam Neeson and it's got Alan Rickman in it, and so definitely check that film out. We'll cover that at some point as well. It's really, really good. But within like that film there, you can see some of the tensions between the people who are pro-treaty and the people who are anti-treaty. And this ends up leading to the Irish Civil War, right? So the pro-treaty IRA eventually end up crushing the anti-treaty IRA. However, in the meantime, the anti-treaty IRA, so the ones who like fully like, no, we don't want to like peace deal with Britain and stuff, and we don't want to have King George still as the head of state. So basically these people are Irish Republicans and they want a united Ireland, and they don't want like King George, or they don't want to be part of the British Empire at all, right? So these are the people who like end up making things very uncomfortable for the residing loyalists who were living in the south, right? And many of these people, as we discussed in our previous video, end up fleeing to Northern Ireland and to Britain itself, right? So very messy kind of thing, very messy situation. And then also on top of that, between 1932 and 1938, the Irish end up doing a trade war with the British, right? So they end up raising tariffs on the British. And this is at a time when, don't forget, that Ireland, almost 90% of its exports went to Great Britain, right? So again, it's a kind of very similar thing to what you see with what ended up becoming the United States. It's a thing where it's like, hold on, overwhelmingly the amount of trade that you're doing is with like your former like kind of colonial masters, However, you're now putting trade barriers between you and them. Like, what the hell? So for many people in Ireland, long time after they had independence, there was almost no economic growth and stuff, right? And it's like, so what was really the point? Like, kind of like, so for many people living in Ireland, years and years after independence, they were like, why did we do this again? Our country's now split in half. We've had to fight this terrible civil war and this war for independence stuff. What was it all for? Like, and then also as well, like in 1937, they end up eventually having an Irish Republic anyway. And then in, I believe, 1949, they end up leaving the Commonwealth. So Ireland ended up being independent anyway, right? So it was just, but it took a long, long time. And it was like, what was all that fighting for, right? It was just, there's no benefit to this. And also, just to give an idea of just how tied Ireland was to the UK, right? So first of all, Ireland only joined the EEC because Britain joined, right? So in 1973, because of this heavy reliance on trade with the UK, Ireland made its decision on whether it was going to join or whether it was not going to join based on what Britain was going to do. So if Britain joined the EEC, Ireland was going to join. If Britain was not going to join the EEC, Ireland was not going to join, right? Because it wouldn't have made sense for Britain to have joined and for Ireland to have stayed out, or for Britain to have stayed out and for Ireland to have joined, because they're so tied economically that it would have hurt Ireland either way. And on top of that, up until 1978, Ireland's currency was controlled directly by the Bank of England. Now, they didn't say it in those kind of ways, but in reality, the Irish pound, or the punt, it had a one-to-one exchange rate with the British pound, which meant that if the British pound went up, then the Irish pound went up. If it went down, it went down. So up until 1978, Ireland had no control over its own currency. That's how tied it was to Britain, right? However, fast forward for all these years, and we can see that Ireland didn't just become richer than Britain. But today, it's even richer than the United States here when it comes to GDP per capita. And this is partly because, small nations, if you look at the rankings here for best standard of living, the highest GDP per capita, et cetera, nearly all kind of things you can look at, right? Small countries of less than 10 million people tend to dominate like those leaderboards, right? So there's a big argument, that actually it's better, it's more accountable, it's more like democratic, it's more, standard of living's a better everything, right? In smaller countries. So for instance, when we look at Scotland, people kind of go, oh, Scotland shouldn't be independent, Wales shouldn't be independent. Well, maybe if you look at it just like now, but in the long run, it does make sense here because they'll probably govern themselves in a better way than as it currently is. And similarly, I think that England should also be independent from the UK, but that's a separate conversation for another time. So people still make the argument, that Britain should have stayed within the EU, when in all cases, Ireland and America were far more integrated within like the British system than we ever were within the European system, right? And never mind the fact that, in terms of languages, we have a shared language. The EU is pretty much just the Tower of Babel, It's got 23 official languages, right? So there's no common kinship, there's no over-reliance on trade. Most of Britain's trade is done outside of the bloc, only 43% of it is done with the EU. So what's the real argument, right? And this is what we're going to kind of look into for the rest of this video.